Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Hackman. I'm a reporter with the Wall Street Journal covering immigration policy in Washington. And I'm here today to discuss the history and future of immigration in America with two really wonderful guests. We have Lynn Yang. She's the deputy national editor of the New York Times and the author of a really wonderful book that many of you have probably already heard of called One Mighty and Irresistible Tide. It's a history of how the country moved from its immigration quota system to the Immigration and Nationality Act passed in 1965, and a group of politicians and activists who made that happen. We're also joined by Michael Clemens. He's the Director of Migration, Displacement, and Humanitarian Policy at the Center of Global Development, where he studies the economic effects and causes of migration around the world. He's published in Migration, Development, Economic History, and his research has been awarded the Royal Economic Society Prize. Thanks so much for both of you for joining me.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I was hoping we could start, this era has been a unique one in terms of some of the immigration restrictions we've seen. I'd love you to both quickly weigh in on, how we got here and what feels unique about this particular time. Does one of you want to go first?
Please, Lynn.
Well, I think there are ways in which it feels unique and in ways in which it doesn't. I mean, I think right out of the gate, I think I'm thinking back really in the early days of the Trump administration with the Muslim travel ban as really setting a tone for what was to come. And the way that was very jarring to people, I think is a good kind of moment to revisit because it tells you both what felt like a departure and also I would argue what felt like a return to the past. This was a really controversial decision right out of the gate because it seemed to single out people from certain countries as being less desirable than others. And then we saw President Trump later, criticize other countries. I'm not even going to say the word, it was so awful, but he labeled some countries as having sort of lesser immigrants coming to the US. That whole tone that was set of like good immigrants versus bad immigrants, desirable countries versus undesirable ones, that's not something we had seen so explicitly in a long time, but really was a hallmark of the American immigration system for at least 40 years between the 20s and the 1960s. So that struck me right away that we were going back to something that I think people felt like we had moved away from or maybe didn't even know we had once done. And I think that one thing that struck me recently, and I want to hear what Michael has to say, is there was a poll that came out. I mean, Trump has been so anti-immigration. I think it actually has kind of created these funny ripple effects in public opinion. So one is that, it's such a big deal. People tie him to anti-immigration policies, and he became so unpopular with so many Americans that for the first time since people have polled this, more Americans want more immigrants to come rather than keeping the number stable or even lowering it. And that's unprecedented. So I find it sort of funny. It's like you have someone who seemed to kind of be a throwback with Stephen Miller of what we had done before as an immigration system. But then you also saw a backlash to that and people saying, no, we want to be a nation of immigrants. So that kind of duality in American history, I thought played out in fascinating ways the last 4 years.
Lynn, I want to follow up with you because I think your book gets to, really chronicles pretty well the history of how anti-Semitism and particularly biased against Eastern Europeans and Asians sort of drove the anti-immigrant legislation that we saw in the early 1920s, that quota system. And you're suggesting now that the anti-immigrant sentiments we're seeing now from the Trump administration have had a pretty fast backlash. What is the difference in your mind between then and now?
Well, I think one of the similarities is that if you just look at the data in terms of how many immigrants we even have in our country, the 20s are a response to the historic levels of migration that we saw coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So in my mind, these are the Italians and Eastern European Jews who really show up in unprecedented numbers and transform cities like New York, right? We can't imagine New York without the contributions from these immigrants who came. And when that happened, there was a sense of, there are too many people who are different, who we can't really assimilate. And, we've got to shut down the borders. These are not the kind of people we want. And I think similarly, someone like Stephen Miller could see that we were kind of returning. I can't speak to what was in his mind, but if you look at the data, we were going back to that level of sort of percent foreign born, that historic high that we hadn't seen in over 100 years.
Right.
And I think that kind of, for people, if you listen to conservatives, that kind of triggered some of this, like, hold on a second, this has gotten out of control, and we need to pull back on it. I think the difference now is just the variety of people coming in is so much more vast, right? When we think about the history of American immigration, we think of Europe, right? This is people from all around the world, including people like, my parents. And it's just the variety. It's just sort of, it's kind of astonishing. Yeah. So I think while there is obviously discrimination, like, it's just a different, it's a feeling of difference, but the variety of difference strikes me as completely unprecedented.
That leads me to my next question for Michael, which is, I think one of the unexpected consequences of immigration reform in the 1960s is exactly what Lynn's talking about, is, America becoming so much more diverse so rapidly that within a few decades will be sort of majority non-white. What is that for you? Tell us about where sentiment is heading for the future of immigration reform.
Well, I thought Lynn was just spot on in her answer. In the best Gallup poll data I've seen, 43% of American adults have at least one immigrant grandparent, and that was also high, back in the 20s. But it was a completely different set of countries. So if there were people saying that Italians are terrorists and Jews are communists, there weren't a whole lot of people whose grandparents could tell them any different from that. Whereas now, when the administration has said really unfounded would be the nicest way to put it, things about Haitians or Mexicans, there are a whole lot of people who not only know such people, but have the people that are being spoken of in their families, and might be quicker to critically assess those views for themselves, or be better informed about that. Let's move on.
What do you think? I mean, how do you think America is going to respond as it continues to diversify? Is there, do you see a future for continued anti-immigrant rhetoric? Do you see us moving in a different direction?
Oh, absolutely. There's as Lynn noted, there are just some very, very strong similarities across U.S. history, and I highly recommend her book. That's one great place to learn about them. The Chinese exclusion came on the heels of by far the longest economic depression in U.S. history, which created a big opportunity for bipartisan demagoguery to blame people's very real economic insecurity, very high unemployment on Chinese people. There's absolutely no economic evidence for that. There were real instances of epidemics being transmitted to the United States by Chinese people in the 1860s and 1870s. It wasn't coronavirus, it was cholera, leprosy, typhus, but those things were very prominent in the public debate. And you had people linking these two exactly as Tom Cotton recently did. However, there's just there's an enormous demographic of forces at work as we look to the next century. One of those, the U.S. Census just put out projections for the U.S. population where they explicitly do the scenarios with and without immigration. And if you look at their zero immigration scenario for the next 30 years, the number of working people per elderly person in the United States in the zero immigration scenario would go from 4 to 2. Wow. That is for every person who is retired and spending their money down, but in the real economy, depending on the goods and services produced by people who are in the workforce, there are 4 of us working for the elderly of America now, and there are going to be 2 without immigrants. So that's people say, well, that's people often refer to that as a pressure for immigration. Getting back to the title of Lynn's book, that somehow there's this a dam that's just holding back the pressure, and that's going to increase the pressure. To me, it's a gigantic opportunity for mutual gain. Americans are going to be aging. The people who are here now, in the absence of others, would be much worse off. People coming here are much better off than they could be, and that's an opportunity for mutually beneficial exchange. And you pointed out people's concerns about high levels of immigration now.
Yes.
Australia and Canada, which, if you've ever been there, are in general fantastic places to live, have much higher foreign-born percentage, and a very large fraction of that from developing countries, I might add, and have for a long time. Toronto, Canada is majority foreign-born. It might be a hellhole in some people's imaginations, but not in this world. So there's that kind of opportunity for mutual gain that's going to be very strong going forward. Could certainly create even more diversity in America, and there's no economic evidence that that's going to be a bad thing.
I'd love to talk to you guys a little bit about how you are thinking about, how immigration advocates can communicate with the country. And Lynn, in your book, you write about this group of politicians, activists. I'm thinking of Emanuel Sellers. He's a son of Jewish immigrants in New York who becomes a congressman, head of the House Judiciary Committee, if I'm remembering correctly. Tell us a little bit about those activists and politicians and, what their story can tell today's immigration advocates about how to move forward.
I think what's really striking to me about what they do, and, frankly, I myself don't have, I think this subject is so fraught that I, in a way, even though I spend a lot of time looking at history, I myself am a little bit flummoxed as to exactly how to structure the right immigration system. So I want to say that up front. I don't pretend to have answers, but in terms of sort of political messaging, one thing that really struck me in what they did was they kind of helped create this new nationalism built around immigrants, which, if we just pause to think about that, that's actually fascinating, because nationalism in my mind often implies, sometimes it can bring about xenophobia. It can be us versus the world. They kind of created one that was built on immigration as part of the American mythology and sort of creation myth. And what struck me as interesting was realizing that before they did this, which was very much a conscious effort in the 1950s, this is when JFK is writing his pamphlet, A Nation of Immigrants. This is when they're really pushing very hard to undo these quotas from the 20s. Before this, people, when you thought about what is like the American creation myth, what is American nationalism, people thought about the American West. That was sort of the foundational sort of, it's very romantic, right? We always have kind of a romantic idea of what it means to be American. It comes with stories, it comes with themes. And if you ask someone in the 50s, what is that romantic myth for America? People would refer to, the American West. And we can think of movies that evoke this. Right. But the way that these people really consciously shifted that story, or at least added an additional one alongside that idea of the West as we are a nation of immigrants, that has struck me as totally politically potent. Because once they did that, it became, if you're against this, you're being anti-American, which is such a turn, right? Usually people would say, well, these people aren't American, we can't have them. And this was a way of turning it on its head and saying, this is how we become more American, is we take in more immigrants. And so I wonder if there's something there to look at that I think is still happening, right? You can see the popularity of people celebrating a nation of immigrants. You can see some of that in the excitement over Kamala Harris, getting elected to vice president. Like, there's still some of that. And with more and more children and grandchildren of immigrants, I wonder if that's kind of a political foundation to work with. Again, I have no opinion as to what you do with that, but I think the history shows you that there's something there. And in a way, the Trump administration's policies have only amped that up. And I just think that's a fascinating thing to think about. We didn't always have that. People had to really create that political message.
It's so interesting you bring up that phrase, because there was a whole episode earlier in this administration that I think our audience is probably familiar with, where the head of Citizenship and Immigration Services actually removed the phrase "a nation of immigrants" from their mission statement.
I'd forgotten that, but that tells you everything.
Yes. Gillian, is there anything in your research that you found, were there messages or things that these activists tried that fell flat or didn't quite work as well?
I mean, I think one thing that's important to look at in the history is that this charge of racism when you're anti-immigrant it was brought up in the 20s, right? I think sometimes we imagine that people in the past didn't realize that what they were saying could seem racist, and our standards have changed. But this has been an argument over and over and over again against immigration restriction. And what struck me reading these old debates that are now 100 years old from the 20s is that the people being accused of this said immediately, I'm not being racist. I just want to preserve the country's culture. I want to preserve the country's sort of cultural DNA for democracy. That's what I'm looking at. I'm not talking about races being superior to others. I'm not a racist. I don't have prejudice in my heart. I am simply trying to preserve a stable America. I want to protect jobs, right? I think that is still with us today. And so I think that's why if you're just sort of charging someone with being racist, it doesn't quite necessarily advance the argument, because there's more here to talk about than just that. And I think people can easily turn back and say, well, what is America, right? Is America based at all on some ethnic cohesiveness? And that's an argument that you see people on the right making over and over and over, or talking about jobs and protecting jobs. I mean, I think to, Michael's point about, it's hard during an economic downturn. I'm thinking of the mass deportation of Mexicans during the Great Depression. The Biden administration might want to overturn some of the Trump administration's immigration policies, but this seems like a very politically difficult time to do that.
Can I just add to that? I don't mean to cut you off, Michelle.
No, please.
I mean, it's everything you say, Jillian, is so true. It goes back much further than that. I mean, the debate about Chinese exclusion was exactly the same when Henry George, the leading U.S. economist at the time, would write to justify Chinese exclusion. He would always start out saying, "It's not that I think the Chinese are inferior. Look at what they've accomplished in their 1,000 years of civilization, et cetera, et cetera. It's just that I'm concerned about workers' wages and public health and their respect for democracy and integration, et cetera, et cetera." Really just identical to today. And some of the passages you can cut and paste, and the text of the congressional debates at the time. It's really just extraordinarily similar. And if some of the other similarities, I'm not at all an activist and certainly not a political scientist. So these are casual thoughts because we're talking about the issue.
Yeah.
When I look across the extraordinary parallels that you see in the past, one thing I notice, and I wish that people involved in political movements would take more note of, is first of all, literally just teaching these facts. A kind of parlor game I play when meeting an Asian American is to, like an Indian American or a Japanese American, is to ask them, when did it become possible for people of Japanese or Indian descent to become U.S. citizens? And it's very rare to find somebody who knows. So that it's not something that was emphasized.
And what is the answer? Tell our audience.
1952, the McCarran-Walter Act undid a policy since 1871 banning from acquiring U.S. citizenship by ethnicity most people in what's called the Asian exclusion zone. And that was just pro forma. The quotas on people entering remained so low, 105 for China, for example, that they're approximately zero, and was not really undone until 1965, just before Jia Lin's family came here, as she discusses in her book. There's just a basic lack of awareness, even among the people whose families were directly affected by this. That I think this conversation and certainly Jillian's book could help to address. Another is as Jillian says, approaching people with charges of racism is just so incredibly unhelpful. Real crises such as pandemics, such as economic depressions, certainly in the 1870s and certainly in California specifically, create opportunities for demagogues to incite people to have feelings about different groups, and those groups are always changing and can be subsets of what we now call white people or non-white people. And it's you can mix and match. But really addressing the underlying problems, which are very real, that people are concerned about dying of typhus in 1870 or concerned about not getting a job in San Francisco in 1879, were real. And the fact that nobody was addressing them at the time gave an opportunity for demagogues to blame things on other groups. And I think that could be better appreciated by some groups who are quick to jump to racist charges.
I want to turn to the moment we're in now, because I think, Michael, you keep hinting at some of the economic struggles that in the past have brought around sort of ethnically targeted policies, public health issues. Now we have more movement than ever. We have people moving around the world. I mean, the coronavirus spread via via people traveling from, Asia to Europe and Europe to here. How do we in the future think about, continuing globalizing and travel in a way that feels safe and that people can feel confident in?
Thank you. This is something I've been studying recently because I became very interested in it as all our lives were vastly affected by the pandemic.
Yeah.
There's a lot of experience with pandemics in the world, unfortunately, and one often hears the charge, not just in policy discussions, but in academic journals, that somehow globalization and the extent of travel is responsible. And like a lot of things in immigration, this seems to be something you don't need evidence for, because look, somebody on a plane brought it here. It must be that if we had less of that, we'd have less of this.
Right.
And the facts just don't bear that out. If you look at the Russian flu pandemic of 1889, or the fall wave of the 1918, what was called the Spanish flu pandemic, those spread just as fast, or faster actually, in the case of the fall wave 1918, than coronavirus. Now think about globalization at that time. By many measures, travel time, or the volume of travel, or the volume of migration, it was less than a tenth of what it is today. And yet in 1889, you have a virus that went from Bukhara, Uzbekistan, now to cover basically the entire world in 4 months. And in fall of 1918, a mutated flu virus that spread from Brest, France, to almost the entire world in 2 months. And it's basically the spread depends on having any sort of interchange of people at all. So yes, we could wipe out 99.9% of all travel, and therefore get a lesser risk of such things happening in the future. Not only is that not going to happen, but it's certainly not a desirable to permanently destroy the world economy in order to prevent hypothetical threats. Things done at the border and behind the border are vastly more effective, and I don't think we even need to review the extensive public health evidence on that. Just look at the United States. If lesser globalization had given us 2 or 3 weeks more warning, would that put us in a different position now? I'd leave it to the public health efforts, who have very seriously criticized the government's response behind the border to what happened, to rule about that. But in the lightest possible terms, a few weeks up front would not have saved any American lives.
Yeah, and I will say the research I reviewed on this, when the Trump administration put in place its travel bans, particularly from Europe, was that travel bans, at best, when done early, can delay the spread of an infectious disease by something like 2 to 3 weeks. But
exactly,
by that time, it was both too late and too porous. You had this infusion of Americans actually rushing back from Europe because they thought they were about to get banned. And some say that could have even made the situation worse.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'd also love to ask you about, I know you said that you're not someone to think about sort of the political messaging implications, but, another really common thing we hear is, there is some real concern by unemployed Americans that having immigrants coming in and taking jobs that they might be eligible for could pose direct competition to them. How do we think about, if you're Joe Biden or on his transition team, how are you thinking about structuring economic policies so that we can grow our economy and also not pose that sort of feeling of direct threat?
I think it's 100% understandable that people feel a threat from immigrants. If you don't have a job, if you've been laid off, you might get hired again, you might not. The mortgage payments are coming due.
Right.
You have people on television telling you that the Kung flu is the fault of Chinese people. I respect those fears, and the problem is that the common sense. What's common sense? Jeff Sessions talks about what's common sense. Stephen Miller talks about what's common sense in immigration. And what's common sense is that people create jobs for each other and create incomes for each other. I don't take your job. Lynn doesn't take my job. You and I do different things, and we specialize in different things. And together, our interaction makes the economy. The reason for that is all of us aren't just sellers of labor. It's common sense that people take jobs and drive down wages when there's a fixed amount of jobs, and more of us selling our labor takes away from that pool. That's not what we are. What's common sense? That you and I are consuming the produce of each other's labor. That's what we do. I don't grow my own vegetables. You and I are investors in stuff, investors in our own human capital at school, investors in real estate, investors in firms through our retirement savings. That's what we are in an economy, and common sense is that more and more people doing that benefit each other. That's why if the dreams of the 83 years of Chinese exclusion had been realized, and Lynn and her family weren't around, none of us would be better off. We'd be worse off. So that's the common sense reality. Now, in extremely difficult economic times of major depression, times when people are out of work, could it be that very large inflows of people can damage the labor market? That certainly could be. Also, there we have some evidence. Giovanni Peri and two co-authors have studied what you mentioned earlier, the Mexican expatriations of the 1930s. Which much more heavily affected certain parts of the country than others, just because the concentration
tell our audience
of Mexicans.
Very briefly what that was.
Oh, I mean, there was a massive policy of seizing and deporting millions of people. Many of them, somewhere between 20 and 30%, many historians estimate, unfortunately, probably U.S. born and thereby by law U.S. citizens of Mexican descent. So it's not even right to call them Mexicans, but Mexicans and people of Mexican descent were rounded up and deported during the Great Depression, greatly motivated by unemployment hitting 30, 40, even higher percent in some places.
Parts of the country, yeah.
And economists have actually gone back, gotten the data on the places very heavily affected by that, and the places where there weren't any Mexicans, so they weren't affected by that. And the employment of Americans actually fell more relative to places where that were not affected by that, and places that were affected by those deportations. And basically, it happened because there were industries in mining and construction and agriculture whose back was broken in local terms by the removal of those critical workers who were fulfilling a specific role in those industries that couldn't survive without them, and the industries either folded up or moved out of that local area, depriving many Americans of employment and better employment. And that's in the middle of by far the worst economic circumstances, much worse than now. So this is not something that's as simple as the common sense crowd will tell you. And I think when you think about who people are in an economy a little more carefully, common sense will tell you something different.
Given what both of you know about the ebb and flow of history and attitude toward immigrants in this country, what do you predict will happen to, the anti-immigrant policies and sentiments of the Trump administration now that he's lost? Are they ebbing? Are they here to stay? How is the Republican Party in particular going to morph from here, if you had to predict?
Well, I try not to predict things. I think one thing I find really fascinating as a journalist, we're only beginning to sift through what just happened.
Yes.
Last week and the weeks prior when people were voting.
Yes.
I mean, it tells you something that I think the Democratic Party has often assumed. I mean, really, for many, many years now, kind of as far back as I can remember, that demographics is destiny for their politics, for their political supremacy. And this is an amazing test of that, right? Because
totally.
Trump is
And
all
we
about,
should say we're recording this less than a week out from the voting. So I think we've still got a lot to learn about where the demographics
yeah, we
go.
do. And I think this is an amazing test case, right? Because Trump was so, he's synonymous with being anti-immigrant. There's no one you can not have followed the news carefully, and you know that Trump was anti-immigration. That's
Yes.
like baseline. You could not know anything about the impeachment or Russia or anything else, but you know about the immigration thing. And yet, as we're still sifting through the results, it wasn't obvious that if you were not white, you voted against him. And so I think there's just a lot to explore there. I think this assumption from the Democratic Party that if you are, if you fall under a certain column and when you check off the race box, you will believe certain things about immigration and about Trump by extension. Mm-hmm. I just think that assumption needs to be tested a little bit more. I mean, the word immigrant, right, and children of immigrants, we don't need to explain here, like a huge variety of people of all different political beliefs and leanings, and not at all a unified bloc that you should expect or assume will vote together. And I think given that that's the case, I mean, the demographic destiny argument, as we see more and more, I mean, I think we're now at a quarter of Americans are either immigrants or children of immigrants. I mean, this is, again, not a guarantee of political success for the Democratic Party. And so that's just a long way of saying, I don't know what that, that doesn't guarantee then that we won't have more anti-immigrant policies, right? Immigrants, I see in my history, immigrants are often, or children of immigrants are often at the very front lines of making arguments to restrict immigration. So there's nothing about our demographics and where we're headed that to me tells us that we should assume anything about our immigration policies. And as I was saying earlier, if anything, the economic, suffering that we're seeing right now, the pandemic, I mean, the Biden administration without a majority in the Senate, which they still have to see if they can get out of Georgia, that really, I think, makes it tougher to have a big economic stimulus package that I think they know they need. And so I see the next couple of years as, potentially a lot more political gridlock. That kind of big economic stimulus maybe isn't coming. And that just lays the groundwork for more of this anti-immigrant feeling, people turning to these policies as a way to solve things, and makes it harder to change what's come before.
Can I tack a footnote on that?
Please.
It's just brilliant and true as always, and I want to mention that the Chinese exclusion, as it was born in the middle of California, was a movement among working class Irish workers who themselves had been subject of an exclusion movement a few decades before from the Know Nothing Party. So this is absolutely nothing new whatsoever. That there are factions within quote unquote immigrants who can be at each other's throats even, and not at all voting as a bloc. And I also want to point out that that's not at all accidental. There's a prominent think tank in Washington, which has been the president's chief advisor on his policies, the Center for Immigration Studies. It was founded. The founding chairman of it was a guy named Otis Graham, who wrote favorably in the 1980s about Chinese exclusion and how it had provided for Oriental Caucasian comity or amity or something like that. And the only thing he didn't like about it was the name. The tagline of the place for years was pro-immigrant, less immigration, which, some people would look at that and say, gosh, wanting there to be fewer blacks in the country, you can't be pro-black under any circumstances. How could it be that you can be pro-immigrant and less for less immigration? And the argument is that more newer immigrants hurt the older immigrants. And I would say there is evidence of economic competition in wages between very recent immigrants and the people who came just before them. That doesn't seem to have often been a reason why those people as a group would favor restriction. If you were to ask them, well, collectively, if it's the case that wages are driven down a little bit for workers in your family, would you support there being nobody else from anybody else's family who can come from Honduras? I haven't met a lot of immigrants who would vote for that, but certainly there was a part of the coalition that just gave 70 billion votes to keep the administration going. that was immigrants in Texas, that was immigrants in Florida who were persuaded by those arguments.
Yeah.
Well, I want to add something, but I'm taking too much time.
No, it's fine. I think we're coming to the end of our time here. And I mean, I think the thing I think about is that we often talk about immigration and race as sort of being inextricably linked. If you're anti-immigrant, you're racist. And some studies I've seen recently, which I think also help explain a little bit of why we've seen Latino voters vote the way they do, is that people don't think of themselves as racial minorities per se. So I think we have quite a lot to look forward to in the next few years. You know, we have our economic and public health issues are not going away. And so I think immigration is going to continue being in the spotlight. Do either of you have any final thoughts?
Please, Jalen.
Yeah.
You know, I think on this issue of race, I do think what I think about a lot is kind of the country's, what we consider race, even how we subdivide all these categories changes all the time. I think we often think of them as pretty static categories when really, because obviously race is a socially constructed thing, we together are always changing what these things mean. So one thing I'm looking toward, I find endlessly fascinating, is what is going to come of this huge block of people who don't vote together, who aren't white or black. You know, I think about Muslim Americans. Where are they supposed to be? They're not even considered Latino or Asian. Like, what are we doing with them? Like, who are all these people? African immigrants, all these people, Hmong refugees who are really different from my family, right? What becomes of all these people? And do these racial categories we have begin to change or shift? And we have all these multiracial Americans. So I'm kind of, we've never been here as a country in this, again, as we talk about, with this level of ethnic diversity. So I am genuinely curious as to how all this begins to change and shift and break down potentially, or stick together or morph into something different. And to me, the election was sort of, again, I can't wait to go in and really pour over what happened, because it's a little bit of like an early signpost of like, where are we headed with these groups, right? They've now had this law for over, the 1965 law for over 50 years. People are here. We have all these American-born children of immigrants. Who are they? What are they becoming? You know, how do we regard them? All of that to me feels very new. And, you know, that when I think about the prior generation that did this from the last big wave, right, the Jews and Italians, and kind of how they assimilated and became white. And that was a new thing that happened. I mean, do some Asian Americans sort of become more white, do multiracial? Like, all of this feels so unwritten to me, with enormous implications about how we think about immigration in the future, and race and our politics. And none of it seems obvious to me, is how I would put it.
If we have a second, could I just say a word?
Sure, please.
But I mean, it's all just so right, and I the way I put it is that it's a decision. It's not something that just happens out there. It's a policy decision. One of the clearest examples of that I've seen is a speech here in Washington in the U.S. Senate, debating Chinese exclusion, when the gentleman says, you know, these Chinese people, they're not interested in citizenship. They're not interested in education. At the time he was speaking, Chinese people since 1871 had been banned from getting U.S. citizenship. And at the time in San Francisco, Chinese kids were banned from schooling. So, you know, complaining about the lack of integration of people at the time that you're actively standing in the way. And you see this right now in the economics literature. There are real studies about the economic integration of Hispanic people using census data, which don't tell you about the legal status of a person. So my gosh, here are some statistics that you can cook up showing that there is limited economic integration, for example, in wage convergence per people of equivalent education levels between Hispanics and not, when a large portion of the group you're studying is banned from active participation in the economy, even if they grew up here. Is kind of circular reasoning, isn't it? We put up these barriers to make sure people don't integrate, and not because they're not integrated. We better not relax any of those barriers, and certainly not have any more of them around. That's a choice, and it's a choice that's been made by on different parts of the political spectrum at different times of history. The anti-immigration movement of the early 1900s was a progressive movement. Some of the same people that that went on to see their dreams realized in FDR's New Deal
Right.
were on the political left building immigration barriers that
Fighting for
culminated
birth
in
control.
21 and 24.
Yes.
And absolutely, it was so it's certainly, there's certainly nothing liberal or progressive about it. Nothing there's nothing inherently conservative or about it, but it's something that the integration of immigrants going forward, and which political party or which group of politicians support they get behind is shaped by choices. And certainly the Republican Party for now has chosen to go just all out towards as far as they can toward Muslim exclusion, and certainly reducing the immigration by Hispanic people, by people from Haiti and Africa specifically, targeted explicitly by the words of the president. It doesn't have to be that way at all. When I was a child, Ronald Reagan took a completely different approach, and 20 years from now, we might see people in the parties that we have now taking a radically different approach, and therefore causing major shifts of sentiment among immigrants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I think we are out of time, but thank you so much to Lynn Yang and to Michael Clemens for joining me, and
thank you
appreciate it
so much.
This was so great. Thank you for having me.
Of course.